Nora Hadley's knees hit the wooden floor so hard she felt the bone crack against the grain. She wasn't praying. She was begging. 26 years old, orphaned, starving, and the only man willing to take her was the one the whole town called an animal. She didn't know that the filthy trapper standing at the back of that courthouse would turn out to be the richest man in Wyoming territory. And she sure as hell didn't know that by the end of the year, every soul in Copper Bend would be begging her. Before we begin, if you love stories about underdogs who rise from nothing, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Stick with me all the way to the end, because this one is going to break your heart and put it back together. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. The auction wasn't supposed to be an auction. They called it a community arrangement, which was just a polite way of saying that Eleanor Hadley had run out of time, and the town of Copper Bend had run out of patience. It was September of 1876, and Nora stood on the raised platform inside the old territorial courthouse, the same building where her father had once delivered sermons to a congregation that loved him. That was before Judge Harlan Beaumont decided Reverend Hadley was a thief. Before the trial that lasted 2 days and the sentence that lasted forever. Before her father died on a prison cot with nothing but a wool blanket and a letter he never got to send. Now his daughter stood in the same room, wearing his shame like a brand. "Let's not waste the afternoon, Miss Hadley." Judge Beaumont's voice rolled across the courtroom like oil on water. He sat in the front row, not on the bench. He didn't need to sit on the bench anymore. He owned the bench. He owned the courthouse. He owned most of the town. "You've been given a generous opportunity. Several men of standing have expressed interest in providing for you. All you need to do is choose." Nora's hands were shaking, but she pressed them flat against the faded cotton of her dress. She wouldn't let them see her tremble. "An opportunity," she repeated. "Is that what you call it, Judge?" "I call it mercy," Beaumont said. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Your father left debts, Miss Hadley. Considerable debts. The church board has filed for repossession of the parsonage. You have no family, no income, no trade. The territory doesn't support women of no means. The workhouse in Cheyenne has a bed waiting for you." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "Unless a man of this community steps forward to take responsibility." The room was full. Nora could feel their eyes on her. The wives who used to bring her father apple pies now stared at her like she was something scraped off a boot. The men leaned against the walls with their arms crossed, sizing her up the way they'd size up a horse at market. "I ain't cattle," Nora said quietly. "No one said you were, dear." That was Mrs. Adeline Pruitt, the banker's wife, sitting in the second row with her gloves folded in her lap. "But a woman alone in this territory, well, it just isn't done. You need a husband, Nora, for your own safety." "My safety?" Nora almost laughed. The last man who promised her safety was her father, and they buried him in an unmarked grave because the church wouldn't pay for a headstone. Beaumont cleared his throat. "Mr. Lyle Crawford has expressed interest." A man in the fourth row stood up. Lyle Crawford was 53, a cattle rancher with a red face and thick hands. He'd buried 2 wives already. The first one fell down the stairs. The second one drowned in a creek that was 3 inches deep. "I'll take her," Crawford said, like he was ordering a meal. "She can cook and keep house. I don't need much else." Nora's stomach turned. She looked at Crawford's hands. They were the hands of a man who broke things. "Mr. Crawford is a respected member of this community," Beaumont said. "A generous offer." "I'd rather die," Nora said. The room went cold. Mrs. Pruitt gasped. Crawford's face turned the color of raw beef. "Now see here," Crawford started. "I said no." Nora's voice cracked, but she didn't look away. "I will sleep in a ditch before I walk into that man's house." The murmurs started. Women whispered behind their hands. Men shook their heads. The general consensus floated through the room like smoke. Ungrateful. Foolish. Just like her father. "Miss Hadley." Beaumont stood up. He was shorter than most men in the room, but when he stood, people shrank. "You seem to misunderstand your position. This is not a negotiation. You will choose a husband today, or you will be escorted to the Cheyenne workhouse on the morning stage. I have signed the order myself." Nora felt the floor tilt beneath her. The workhouse. She knew what happened to women in the workhouse. They went in young and came out old, if they came out at all. "Surely there's another way," said a voice from the side of the room. It was Reverend Isaac Pruitt, the new pastor, a thin man with kind eyes who had replaced her father. "The church could provide temporary shelter. We could." "The church has no funds for charity, Reverend," Beaumont cut him off without even looking at him. "Not since the, shall we say, irregularities in the previous administration." The accusation hung in the air. Nora's father. The money that was never stolen. The lie that Beaumont had constructed so carefully that even God himself couldn't find the seams. Nora closed her eyes. She could feel the walls closing in. The room was too hot. The air was too thick. Her father's ghost was everywhere in this courthouse, and she was standing in the exact spot where they'd convicted him. "Anyone else?" Beaumont called out, his voice ringing with amusement. "Any man willing to take on the burden of Reverend Hadley's daughter?" Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Nora opened her eyes. She would not cry. She would not give this town the satisfaction. "I reckon I will." The voice came from the back of the room. It was low and rough, like someone dragging a boot across gravel. Every head in the courthouse turned. A man stood in the doorway. He was enormous. 6'2", maybe taller, with shoulders that filled the frame. He wore a buckskin coat that was more stained than leather, mud-caked boots, and a hat so battered it looked like it had been trampled by a horse. A thick black beard covered most of his face. His hair was too long, hanging past his collar. He smelled like wood smoke and pine pitch and something else, something wild. It was Josiah Mercer, the Mountain Man. The reaction was immediate. "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Pruitt whispered, pulling her shawl tighter.
"Is that the Mercer hermit?"
Someone hissed. Crawford let out a bark of laughter. "You can't be serious. That animal can barely keep himself fed. What's he going to do with a wife?" Josiah didn't respond to any of them. He walked forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. The crowd parted, not out of respect, out of revulsion. He moved through them like a bear through brush, slow, deliberate, and completely unconcerned with their opinion. He stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at Nora. She looked down at him. His face was mostly hidden by the beard, but his eyes were visible. They were dark brown, almost black, and they held a steadiness she hadn't seen in any man in this room. No greed, no calculation, just a quiet, immovable calm. "Ma'am," Josiah said. He tipped his battered hat. "I got a cabin up past the ridge. It ain't much, but it's warm. There's food. I got no debts, and I don't drink." He paused. "And I don't hit." The last two words landed in the room like a gunshot. Crawford's face went white, then purple. Every woman in the room suddenly found something fascinating about the floor. Nora stared at Josiah Mercer. Her mind was racing. She knew the stories. Everyone knew the stories. He came down from the mountain once a month to trade furs and buy supplies. He spoke to no one. He'd been living alone up there for nearly 10 years. Some said he was a deserter from the war. Others said he was a wanted man. A few whispered that he'd killed his own family and fled to the wilderness to hide from the law. He was, by every measure of civilized society, the worst possible choice. "Miss Hadley," Beaumont said, and for the first time there was something other than amusement in his voice. There was irritation. "You cannot seriously consider this." "Why not?" Nora asked, still looking at Josiah. "Because he's a vagrant, a hermit. He lives like a savage. He has no standing, no property of value. No. I asked him a question, Judge, not you." Nora's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. She turned back to Josiah. "Why?" Josiah held her gaze. "Why what, ma'am?" "Why me? You don't know me. You haven't spoken to me before. Why would you walk in here and offer to take on a woman with nothing but debt and disgrace?" The room held its breath. Josiah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so low that only Nora and the first 2 rows could hear him. "I knew your father, Miss Hadley. Not well, but enough. He was a good man who got railroaded by men who weren't. I was there the day they took him away." He paused. "I didn't do nothing to stop it. That sat with me a long time." Nora's chest tightened. Her father. This man had watched her father be destroyed and done nothing. Just like everyone else in this room. But he was the only one who admitted it. The only one who called it what it was. "So this is guilt," Nora said. "No, ma'am," Josiah said. "This is a debt, and I pay my debts." "How romantic," Crawford sneered from his seat. "The beggar and the savage. You'll be eating bark by Christmas." Josiah turned his head slowly and looked at Crawford. He didn't say a word. He just looked. Something in that gaze made Crawford sink back into his chair, like a man who just remembered that some animals bite. Nora looked at Beaumont. The judge was watching her with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight. She could see the calculation behind his mask of concern. He wanted her broken. He wanted her married to Crawford or shipped to the workhouse, somewhere he could control her, somewhere she could never ask questions about her father's trial. She looked at Crawford, with his cruel hands and his dead wives. She looked at the rest of the room, at the people who had eaten her father's food and sung in his choir, and then turned their backs when it mattered. And she looked at Josiah Mercer. Dirty, wild, alone, honest. "I accept," Nora said. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Then chaos. "This is absurd," Crawford shouted, jumping to his feet. "She can't marry that. He's not even civilized. I demand—" "You demand nothing, Mr. Crawford." Nora stepped down from the platform. Her legs were shaking, but her voice was iron. "I have made my choice. The judge said I must choose a husband. I have chosen." She walked straight to Josiah and stopped in front of him. Up close, he was even larger. She had to tilt her head back to look at his face. He smelled like the forest, like earth and rain and something ancient. "If you lay a hand on me," she whispered, so only he could hear, "I will kill you in your sleep." The ghost of something, not quite a smile, passed through Josiah's eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I expect you would." "Miss Hadley, I must protest." Beaumont had crossed the room. He was standing too close. His cologne was suffocating. "This man cannot provide for you. The territory requires that a husband demonstrate adequate means." "I got means," Josiah said, not looking at the judge. "A shack and some animal pelts do not constitute means, Mr. Mercer." Josiah reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He opened it and poured the contents onto the judge's hand. 3 gold nuggets, each the size of a man's thumb. The room went silent again. "Found 'em in the creek," Josiah said flatly. "There's more where that came from. That enough means for you, Judge?" Beaumont stared at the gold in his hand. His eyes changed. Nora saw it. That flash of hunger, raw and bottomless, that passed across his face before he could mask it. "Where exactly did you find these, Mr. Mercer?" Beaumont asked, his voice suddenly smooth, friendly, interested. Josiah took the nuggets back, one by one, plucking them from the judge's palm. "In the creek," he repeated. He dropped them back in the pouch and tucked it away. "We done here?" Beaumont's jaw tightened, but the law was the law, even his law. A willing bride, a groom with means. He had no grounds to refuse. "Reverend Pruitt," Beaumont called, his voice clipped. "Perform the ceremony." The wedding took 4 minutes. Reverend Pruitt's hands trembled as he read from the Bible. Nora's voice barely carried when she said her vows. Josiah said, "I do," like he was confirming a trade at the general store. There was no kiss. There was no celebration. When it was done, Josiah offered Nora his arm. She took it. His forearm beneath the buckskin was hard as timber. They walked toward the door. The crowd parted again, but this time the whispers were different. Sharper. Meaner. "Dead by winter," someone muttered. "She'll come crawling back inside a week," Mrs. Pruitt said to Mrs. Gable. "Fool girl, just like her fool father." Nora didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the bright square of daylight at the end of the aisle. But Josiah stopped. He turned, slowly, and looked back at the room. He found Beaumont in the crowd. The judge was standing by the window, rolling one of his rings between his fingers, watching them leave with an expression that Nora couldn't read. Josiah held the judge's gaze for a long, dangerous moment. Then he tipped his hat. "Much obliged, Judge," Josiah said, "for taking such good care of her." There was nothing in his voice but courtesy, and yet Beaumont's hand stopped turning the ring. Something cold and electric passed between the two men. Josiah turned back to Nora. "Let's go, Mrs. Mercer." They walked out into the bright September afternoon. A battered wagon waited at the end of the street, hitched to a single mule that looked about as tired as Nora felt. "It's a long ride," Josiah said, helping her up onto the bench. 3 days to the cabin. You should eat." He reached behind the seat and handed her a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was bread, dried venison, and a small jar of honey. Nora stared at the food. It was more than she'd eaten in 3 days. Her eyes burned, but she blinked hard and unwrapped the bread. "Thank you," she said quietly. Josiah climbed up beside her. He didn't answer. He just picked up the reins. Behind them, inside the courthouse, Judge Harlan Beaumont stood at the window, watching the wagon pull away. His fingers had gone back to the ring, turning it slowly, methodically. "Mr. Crawford," Beaumont said, without turning around. Crawford appeared at his shoulder, still fuming. "That dirty animal just stole my wife, Judge." "She was never your wife." Beaumont's voice was distant, calculating. "But that gold, those nuggets didn't come from any creek. I've had every creek in this territory assayed." "So where'd he get them?" Beaumont watched the wagon grow smaller against the mountain. His eyes narrowed. "That's exactly what I intend to find out." He turned from the window and straightened his vest. "Send a rider to Red Elk Station. Tell Billy Pardo I have a job for him. I want to know where Josiah Mercer lives, what he's hiding, and how much of it there is." Crawford grinned. "And the girl?" Beaumont picked up his hat and set it on his head with the careful precision of a man who controlled everything he touched. The girl, he said, will come home when there's nothing left to come home to. The wagon creaked north, toward the mountains. Nora ate the bread in silence, watching the town of Copper Bend shrink behind her. She had just married a stranger. She had no idea where she was going. She had no money, no possessions, nothing but the dress on her back and a name that meant shame. But for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't afraid. And that scared her more than anything. The mule had a name. That was the first thing Nora learned about Josiah Mercer that surprised her. "Clementine," he said, on the morning of the second day, when the mule stopped dead in the middle of a creek crossing and refused to move. Josiah climbed down from the wagon, walked to the front, and placed his hand flat on the mule's forehead. "Come on, Clem. You've done this 100 times." The mule snorted and stamped her hoof in the shallow water. "She doesn't like the current," Josiah said, glancing back at Nora. "It's faster than last month. Rain's been heavy up high." Nora watched him. He was talking to the mule the way a father talks to a stubborn child. Patient, gentle, no frustration, no force. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of dried apple. Clementine ate it, considered her options, and walked forward. "You named your mule," Nora said, when he climbed back onto the bench. "She's earned a name," Josiah said. "She's carried me through 2 blizzards and a rock slide. That's more than most people have done." It was the longest string of words he'd spoken since they left Copper Bend. Nora tucked it away in her mind, adding it to the small collection of things she knew about her husband. He was patient with animals. He carried dried apples in his pocket. He trusted a mule more than he trusted people. They climbed higher. The air thinned and cooled. The pines grew denser, pressing in on both sides of the trail until the sky was just a narrow ribbon of blue above them. Nora's lungs burned with the altitude, but she didn't complain. She wouldn't give him a reason to regret his choice, and she wouldn't give herself a reason to feel weak. That first night, Josiah set up camp with a speed and precision that spoke of years of practice. He built a lean-to for her from canvas and branches, laid out 2 heavy fur blankets inside, and then sat down by the fire a good 15 feet away, his rifle across his knees. Nora stood by the lean-to, looking at him across the firelight. "You're not sleeping under the cover?" "No, ma'am. It's cold." "I've been cold before." She watched him for a moment. The firelight caught the scar on his left arm, where his sleeve had ridden up. It was thick and jagged, the kind of scar that came from something worse than an accident. "The war?" she asked. Josiah looked down at his arm. He pulled the sleeve back into place. "Yes, ma'am." "Which side?" "The one that won." He poked the fire with a stick. Not that winning felt like much of anything. Nora sat down on a flat rock near the fire, pulling one of the fur blankets around her shoulders. It was incredibly soft. Bear, maybe. Or elk. "My father preached against the war," she said. "He said killing was killing, no matter what flag you put on it. Half the congregation walked out. The other half said he was a coward." "Was he?" "No. He was the bravest man I ever knew." Her voice caught. She hadn't spoken about her father out loud in months. He just believed that mercy was stronger than violence. That's what got him killed. He showed mercy to the wrong people, and they buried him for it. Josiah was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled and popped between them. An owl called somewhere in the darkness. "Your father baptized a man named Thomas Gatewood," Josiah said suddenly. "A freedman, about 11 years ago." Nora frowned. "I remember. Mr. Gatewood. He and his wife Ruth came to the church just after the war. Papa was the only preacher in the territory who would let them through the door." "I know," Josiah said. "Thomas works for me." Nora stared at him. Thomas Gatewood works for you? Him and Ruth. They've been with me since I came up to the mountain. Your father gave Thomas something nobody else would. Dignity. A place in God's house. Josiah looked at her. The firelight turned his dark eyes to amber. A man who does that for a stranger, when it costs him everything. That ain't a coward. That's the strongest kind of man there is. Nora's throat closed. She pressed her lips together hard and looked away, blinking fast. She would not cry in front of this man. She would not cry in front of anyone. Crying was a luxury she'd given up the day they put her father in the ground. Get some sleep, Mrs. Mercer, Josiah said quietly. Tomorrow's harder. She lay in the lean-to, wrapped in the furs, staring up at the canvas overhead. She could hear Josiah moving by the fire, the soft click of him checking his rifle, the steady rhythm of his breathing. He was 10 feet away, a stranger with a gun, and she felt safer than she had in 2 years. That was the thing that kept her awake. The second day nearly killed her. The trail turned steep and narrow, switchbacking up the face of a granite ridge. On one side, the rock wall pressed close enough to scrape the wagon. On the other, the world dropped away into nothing. Nora could hear water far below, a river she couldn't see, churning in the darkness of the canyon. She gripped the edge of the bench until her fingers went numb. Eyes open, Josiah said. His voice was calm, the same tone he used with Clementine. Don't look down. Look at me. Nora looked at him. His hands on the reins were steady, not a tremor. He guided the mule around a jutting boulder with the casual precision of a man threading a needle. You've done this before, she said through clenched teeth. Every month for 10 years. And you've never fallen? The mule hasn't, Josiah said. I fell once, first year. Caught a tree branch about 40 feet down. Hung there for 6 hours before I could climb back up. That's not comforting. Wasn't meant to be. Meant to tell you that even if you fall, you hold on. She looked at his profile. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about the trail. They made it past the ridge by noon. The trail widened and the trees opened up, and suddenly they were in a high valley that took Nora's breath away. A lake sat at the center, still as glass, reflecting the peaks above. Wildflowers grew everywhere, purple and yellow and white, carpeting the meadow in color. But Nora's eyes went straight to the structure at the edge of the tree line. A cabin, if you could call it that. It was small, listing to one side, with a sagging roof and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. Chickens pecked in the dirt out front. A thin curl of smoke rose from a chimney that looked like it might collapse at any moment. Her heart dropped into her stomach. This was it. This was what she had married into. A ruin on a mountain. The town was right. She had traded one kind of suffering for another. Josiah pulled the wagon to a stop. He sat still for a moment, watching her face. She knew he was reading her. She could feel his gaze like a physical weight. Nora swallowed hard. She thought of Crawford's hands. She thought of the workhouse in Cheyenne. She thought of her father's voice, steady and warm, telling her that a home isn't made of walls. It's made of who's inside them. The roof needs patching, she said. Her voice didn't shake. And that door has to be rehung. Where do you keep the tools? Josiah stared at her. For a full 5 seconds he didn't move. Then he exhaled, a long, slow breath, like a man who'd been holding it for years. You're something, Mrs. Mercer, he said quietly. I'm practical, Mr. Mercer. There's a difference. He almost smiled. She could see it, the way the skin around his eyes tightened, the way his beard shifted just slightly. Almost. Don't go inside, he said. Nora stopped, 1 foot on the ground, one still on the wagon step. Why not? Because that's not where we're going. He climbed down and walked past the shack, past the chickens, toward a wall of dense spruce trees that grew against the base of the cliff.
Nora watched him, confused. He reached into the branches and she heard a metallic click, the sound of a mechanism engaging. The cliff moved. Nora took a step back. A section of rock, covered in moss and lichen, swung inward on enormous hinges. Behind it was a tunnel, wide enough for the wagon, lined with smooth stone and lit by gas lamps that flared to life one by one as the draft rushed through. "What in God's name?" Nora whispered.
Josiah turned back to her. Something in his posture had changed. He was standing taller. The slouch of the mountain trapper was gone. In its place was the bearing of a man who was used to standing in rooms that mattered. "My father wasn't a trapper, Nora," he said. "His name was Thaddeus Mercer. He was a mining engineer. He found the largest silver vein in the territory, right here, inside this mountain. But he'd seen what money did to men. He'd seen the wars it started, the families it destroyed. So he hid it. He built this." He held out his hand.
"Come inside. Let me show you the truth."
Nora didn't take his hand. Not yet. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie. You let me believe you were poor. You let me believe I was going to live in that shack. You sat there on that wagon bench for 3 days and watched me prepare myself for a life of nothing. And you said nothing." "That's right," Josiah said. He didn't look away. He didn't apologize. "I did." "Why?" "Because I needed to know." "Know what?" "If you were here for me, or for what I have." His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "I've been alone for 10 years, Nora. In that time, 3 women have found their way up this mountain. Every single one of them was sent by someone. By men who'd heard rumors about Thaddeus Mercer's mine. They came with sweet words and soft smiles, and every single one of them had a partner waiting in the valley with a gun and a sack." He took a breath. "I watched you stand on that platform and refuse a rich man because he was cruel. I watched you choose poverty over abuse. I watched you look at that shack and ask for a broom." His voice dropped. "No one has ever asked for a broom." Nora felt the anger warring with something else in her chest, something that ached. "I am not a test, Josiah." "No," he said. "You're the answer to one, and I'm sorry for it. But I won't apologize for being careful. Careful is how I'm still alive." They stood there, 10 feet apart, the tunnel yawning open behind him like the mouth of some ancient creature. The gas lamps hissed softly. The mountain waited. Nora took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm and steady. He led her inside. The tunnel curved gently downward, the stone walls giving way to polished granite. The air was cool but not cold, and it smelled faintly of cedar and lamp oil. Then the tunnel opened up, and Nora stopped breathing. It was a house. No, it was a mansion, built inside a cavern so vast that the ceiling disappeared into shadows. Natural stone pillars had been carved into smooth columns. The floor was polished marble. High above, narrow fissures in the rock had been fitted with glass and mirrors that caught the daylight and sent it streaming down in golden shafts. It was like standing inside a cathedral made by the earth itself. "Oh my God," Nora breathed. "Master Josiah!" A woman's voice rang out across the hall. Footsteps hurried toward them. A black woman in her 60s appeared, silver hair pulled back, wearing a crisp dark dress with a white apron. Her face was creased with worry and relief in equal measure. Behind her, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with gray at his temples followed at a steadier pace. "Ruth," Josiah said. "Thomas." Ruth Gatewood stopped in front of them. Her eyes went from Josiah to Nora, taking in the patched dress, the dusty face, the worn boots. Then she looked at their joined hands.
"Lord, have mercy," Ruth said. "You went to town for flour and salt. You came back with a wife."
"Things took a turn," Josiah said. Thomas Gatewood stood behind his wife, his arms folded. He looked at Nora for a long moment, and she could see him searching her face for something. Then his expression softened. "Reverend Hadley's girl," Thomas said quietly. "I'd know those eyes anywhere. Your father's eyes." The kindness in his voice broke something in Nora that 3 days of hardship and fear had not. Her chin trembled. She pressed her lips together and nodded. Ruth moved forward and took Nora's other hand, the one that wasn't holding Josiah's. "Child," she said, and her voice was warm as a hearth fire. "Your daddy baptized my Thomas when no other preacher would touch him. He stood up in front of that whole town and said, 'This man is a child of God, same as any of you.' They threw rocks at the church that night.
Your father swept up the glass and held service the next Sunday like nothing happened."
A tear slid down Nora's cheek. She couldn't stop it. "You're home now," Ruth said firmly. "And I don't care if you married this fool for love or desperation or because you lost a bet. You're a Hadley, and in this house, that name means something." Josiah cleared his throat. "Ruth, maybe we could give her a moment to—" "You hush," Ruth said, not looking at him. "You dragged this girl up a mountain for 3 days and didn't even tell her what she was walking into, did you?" Josiah said nothing. "That's what I thought." Ruth put her arm around Nora's shoulders. "Come with me, sweetheart. I've got hot water, clean clothes, and about 6 questions for that husband of yours that he's going to answer whether he likes it or not." As Ruth led her deeper into the mansion, Nora looked back. Josiah was standing in the great hall, watching her go. Thomas had moved to stand beside him. She could hear the older man's voice, low and even. "You told her the truth?" "Most of it," Josiah said. "The gold?" "She saw the cabin. She chose to stay." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Her father would have liked you, son. Her father would have punched me for what I just put her through." "That too," Thomas agreed. "That too." Nora turned away and followed Ruth down a corridor lit by gas lamps, the marble floor cool beneath her worn boots. She was inside a mountain. She was married to a man who owned a hidden fortune. Her father's name had been spoken with love for the first time in 2 years. She didn't understand any of it, but she understood one thing. Josiah Mercer had tested her. He had watched her choose the shack, the chickens, the broken door. He had watched her square her shoulders and ask for a broom. And something in that moment had passed between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of one survivor looking at another. She was in the dragon's mountain now, and the dragon had given her the key. But keys, Nora knew, could lock doors just as easily as they opened them. And somewhere far below, in the town of Copper Bend, Judge Harlan Beaumont was turning his gold ring and asking questions that Josiah Mercer did not want answered. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to higher ground. 3 weeks inside the mountain changed Nora in ways she didn't expect. It wasn't the marble floors, or the gas lamps, or the library with its 1,200 books that her fingers itched to touch every morning. It wasn't even the hot water that Ruth drew for her each evening, heated by the thermal vents deep in the rock, a luxury she hadn't known since her father was alive. What changed Nora was the silence. Not the silence of loneliness. She knew that silence intimately. This was different. This was the silence of a man sitting across a mahogany table, reading by lamplight, completely at ease with her presence. The silence of two people sharing a room without needing to fill it. Josiah had given her the east wing. He stayed in the west. They met for meals, prepared by Ruth, who cooked like a woman waging war against hunger itself. They ate together. They talked, a little more each day. Then they parted. He never crossed the invisible line between courtesy and closeness. It was driving Nora out of her mind. "He won't even look at me," Nora said to Ruth one morning, sitting in the kitchen while the older woman kneaded bread dough with the force of a woman who had opinions. "He looks past me. He looks at the wall behind me. He looks at the table. He looks at everything in the room except me." "He looks at you plenty," Ruth said, punching the dough. "He just waits until you're not looking back." "That's ridiculous." "That's Josiah." Ruth flipped the dough and slammed it down again. "That man has been alone so long, he's forgotten how to be with people. He can track a deer through a snowstorm and navigate a cliff in the dark. But put him in a room with a woman he cares about, and he turns into a fence post. He doesn't care about me. He cares about protecting his secret." Ruth stopped kneading. She looked at Nora with a kind of directness that made people either love Ruth Gatewood or avoid her entirely. "Child, that man walked into a courtroom full of people who despise him and offered his name to a woman he barely knew. He gave you his mother's clothes. He gave you the East Wing, which he hasn't opened since the day his mother died in it." She pointed a flour-covered finger at Nora. "If that's not caring, I don't know what is. He just doesn't know how to say it because nobody ever taught him." "What happened to him?" Nora asked. "In the war. What happened?" Ruth's hands went still on the dough. The kitchen was quiet except for the hiss of the gas lamps. "That's his story to tell, Nora, not mine. But I'll say this much. He came back from that war missing more than the piece of his arm that the surgeons took. He came back missing whatever part of a man believes the world is good. Thomas saw it. I saw it. That boy climbed up this mountain and never came down because he decided people weren't worth the trouble." "Then why did he come for me?" Ruth smiled. It was a sad smile, one that held years of watching a broken man pretend he wasn't broken. "Because some part of him still hopes he's wrong." That night, Nora didn't go to the East Wing after dinner. She went to Josiah's study. She didn't knock. She pushed open the heavy doors and walked in. Josiah was at his desk, writing in a leather-bound ledger. He'd trimmed his beard, and in the lamplight, without the wild hair and the buckskin, he looked like a different man. Younger, sharper, the kind of man you'd see in a boardroom in San Francisco, not a cave in Wyoming. He looked up, startled. "Nora, is everything all right?" "No," she said. She crossed the room and stood in front of his desk. "Nothing is all right. We've been married for 3 weeks. You sleep on the other side of this mountain. You speak to me like I'm a guest in a hotel. You are unfailingly polite and impossibly distant, and I am losing my patience." Josiah set down his pen. "I'm trying to give you space." "I've had space my entire life, Josiah. I've had so much space I could scream into it and nobody would hear. I don't need more space. I need you to tell me why you really brought me here." "I told you why." "You told me you owed a debt to my father. You told me you needed someone who wouldn't betray you. Those are reasons to hire a housekeeper, not marry a woman. What is the real reason?" Josiah stood up. He walked around the desk and stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the pulse in his throat, close enough that she could smell the cedar soap Ruth made him use now instead of creek water. "You want the truth?" "I have wanted the truth since the moment I stepped onto that wagon."
Josiah was quiet. She watched him struggle with it, watched the war behind his eyes, the part of him that had been alone for a decade, fighting the part that had walked into a courtroom and chosen her. "I was in the back of that courthouse for 20 minutes before I spoke," he said. "I came to town for supplies. I heard the commotion. I walked in and I saw you standing on that platform." He paused. "You were shaking so hard I could see it from the back row. Your hands were trembling and your dress was patched, and you had nothing. Absolutely nothing. And Crawford stood up and said he'd take you like you were a sack of flour." His voice dropped. "And you said no." He took a breath. "I have watched men with guns and armies fold under less pressure than what that room put on you. Generals, colonels, men who commanded thousands. They would have broken. You didn't. You looked that man in the eye and you said you'd rather starve." He looked at her, and this time he didn't look away. "I didn't marry you because of your father, Nora. I married you because in that moment you were the strongest person I had ever seen, and I have been in rooms full of soldiers." Nora's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Josiah, I don't know how to do this," he said. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. "I spent 4 years in the war watching men die. I spent 10 years on this mountain making sure I'd never have to watch anyone die again. I built walls, real ones and the other kind. And now you're standing in my study in my mother's dress, asking me to tear them down, and I—" He stopped. His hands were at his sides, clenched into fists, not from anger, from the effort of holding himself together. Nora closed the distance between them. She reached up and put her hand on his face, her palm against his jaw, her fingers in his trimmed beard. He flinched at the touch. Then he leaned into it, like a man who'd been standing in the cold for 10 years, and someone had finally lit a fire. "I'm not asking you to tear anything down," she whispered. "I'm asking you to let me in." Josiah closed his eyes. When he opened them, the wall was gone. What she saw behind it was raw and vast and terrifying. It was loneliness so deep it had its own gravity. It was grief that had calcified into stone. And beneath all of it, burning like a coal that refused to die, was hope. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, 10 years of silence breaking open like a dam. His hands came up to her face, shaking, holding her like she was the most fragile and the most powerful thing he had ever touched. Nora kissed him back with everything she had, with the grief of her father, and the fury of her exile, and the terrifying, intoxicating relief of being wanted by someone who had seen her at her worst and chosen her anyway. The study door burst open. Thomas Gatewood stood in the doorway, soaking wet and breathing hard. Rain dripped from his coat onto the marble floor. His face was gray. "Josiah," Thomas said. His voice was controlled, but his eyes were wild. "We got a problem." Josiah pulled back from Nora. The transformation was instant. The tender man who had just kissed her like the world was ending disappeared. In his place was the soldier. His eyes went flat, his jaw set. His hand moved to the desk where a revolver lay beside the ledger. "Talk to me." "Perimeter wire on the South Ridge triggered 20 minutes ago. I went to the lookout." Thomas swallowed. "There are riders, 8 of them, coming up the switchback trail." 8. Josiah's voice was ice. "At night, in a storm. That's not prospectors." "No, sir. And the lead rider is on a black horse. Big man. Fancy saddle." Nora felt the blood leave her face. "Beaumont." "He ain't alone," Thomas continued. "I saw a man on foot ahead of the group. Tracking. Moving fast. He's reading the ground, even in this rain.
Billy Pardo, Josiah said. He picked up the revolver and checked the cylinder. Best tracker between here and the Missouri. If Beaumont hired him, he's already found the wheel ruts leading to the cliff. The decoy shack? Nora asked. Won't fool Pardo. That man can track a trout through a river. Josiah moved to the wall and pulled a rifle from the rack. He loaded it with a speed that made Nora's stomach tighten. How long? 40 minutes, Thomas said. Maybe less. The storm's slowing them on the switchbacks, but Pardo's leading them true. The blast doors? Sealed. But Josiah, if they brought blasting powder. They brought blasting powder. Josiah turned to Nora. His face was hard, but his eyes, those eyes that had just looked at her with 10 years of loneliness, were full of something she recognized. Fear. Not for himself. For her. Nora, there's a ventilation shaft in the pantry. It comes out on the north face. You and Ruth need to... No, this isn't a discussion. You're right, it's not. Nora walked to the wall rack and pulled down a shotgun. She broke it open the way she'd watched Josiah do during the target practice he'd given her last week. The sessions he'd said were just for mountain lions and bears. She'd known even then that he was preparing her for something worse. You have 4 people in this house. You need every one of them. Nora, these men will kill you. These men killed my father. Her voice was cold and even in a way that surprised even her. Beaumont sent him to prison. Beaumont stole his church. Beaumont took everything he had and then stood in that courtroom and sold me like livestock. If he's coming up this mountain, I'm going to be standing at the top of it when he arrives. Josiah stared at her. Thomas looked at the floor, but Nora caught the faint nod the older man gave, a gesture of respect. Ruth! Josiah called out. Ruth appeared in the corridor. She'd already changed into a dark dress with her sleeves rolled up. She was carrying a cast-iron skillet in one hand and a box of rifle cartridges in the other. I heard, she said. I ain't running either, so don't bother asking. Josiah looked at the 3 of them, his wife with a shotgun, his housekeeper with a skillet and ammunition, his manservant with a machete, against 8 armed men and the most powerful judge in the territory. All right, Josiah said. His voice was quiet but absolute. Then we fight. He moved fast, issuing orders with the calm precision of a man who had commanded soldiers under fire. Thomas was sent to the blast doors to monitor the breach. Ruth was positioned in the kitchen corridor with the rifle, covering the secondary tunnel that connected to the lower mine shafts. Nora was placed at the top of the main staircase, behind a marble pillar, with the shotgun and a pouch of shells. Josiah stood in the center of the great hall, looking up at the mirrors that channeled moonlight through the fissures above. When they breach the doors, they'll come through the main tunnel. They'll have torches. The light will blind them in the hall if we keep it dark. He picked up an iron poker from the fireplace. With a single violent swing, he shattered the main mirror array. The hall plunged into darkness. Only the faint hiss of gas lamps in the far tunnel remained. They waited. Nora crouched behind the pillar, her shoulder pressed against the cold marble, the shotgun heavy in her hands. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her teeth. She thought about her father. She thought about the Sunday mornings when he'd stand at the pulpit and talk about David and Goliath, about Moses and Pharaoh, about ordinary people who stood against impossible odds because they had something worth standing for. She had something worth standing for now. The first explosion hit the blast doors with a sound like God slamming his fist on a table. The marble floor vibrated. Dust rained from the ceiling. Nora heard Josiah's voice, steady in the darkness. Hold! A second blast, closer. The screech of metal being pried apart. Men's voices echoing down the tunnel, muffled by stone, but growing louder. Then a third blast, and the sound of the doors giving way, a groaning, tortured surrender of iron and rock. "They're through!" Thomas shouted from the corridor. "Kill the lamps!" Josiah commanded. Thomas turned the gas valve. The last light died. The sanctuary plunged into absolute blackness. Nora could hear them now. Boots on stone, the crackle of torches, heavy breathing. And then a voice she recognized. A voice that had haunted her dreams for 2 years. "Mercer!" Judge Harlan Beaumont's voice boomed down the tunnel, distorted by the acoustics into something monstrous. "I know you're in here, boy. Come on out. We can settle this like civilized men." Silence. "I've got 8 men, Mercer, all armed. We've got enough powder to bring this whole mountain down on your head. Sign over the mineral rights, and I'll let you walk away. You and the girl." The torchlight entered the great hall. Nora watched from above as the orange glow spread across the marble floor, pushing back the darkness inch by inch. She could see them now. 8 men, spread out, guns drawn. Beaumont walked in the center, his fine coat dusted with rock powder, his gold ring catching the firelight. Beside him, a lean man in a slouch hat moved with the careful, silent steps of a predator. Billy Pardo. And behind them, bringing up the rear with a pickaxe over his shoulder and a grin on his face, was Lyle Crawford. Of course Crawford was here. The man who had wanted to buy her was now here to take what she'd chosen instead. The torchlight hit the gold-inlaid columns. The marble floor gleamed, and every single man in that group stopped moving. "Jesus Christ," Pardo whispered. "It's real." Beaumont's face transformed. The mask of judicial authority, the careful composure of a man who controlled a territory, melted away. What was underneath was naked, trembling greed. He looked at the columns, the marble, the vast hall, and his eyes went wet. "It's all real," Beaumont breathed. "Every rumor, every legend. The Mercer mine." He laughed, a high cracking sound that echoed off the stone. "I own this. This is mine by territorial right. Mercer squatted on government land. This all belongs to." The rifle shot came from the darkness above. The torch in the hand of the man next to Beaumont exploded in a shower of sparks. The man screamed and dropped the flame. "You own nothing!" Josiah's voice rang out from somewhere in the upper balcony. Nora couldn't see him. She could only hear him, and his voice was the coldest thing she had ever heard. Colder than the mountain. Colder than the river in the canyon below. "You're standing in my home, Beaumont. You broke down my door. You brought armed men into my house, where my wife sleeps." "Your wife." Beaumont had ducked behind a column, his bravado cracking. "The Hadley girl? You think I care about that worthless?" Nora pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast echoed through the hall like the voice of God. She hadn't aimed at Beaumont. She'd aimed at the floor 2 feet in front of him. Marble chips exploded upward, stinging his face. He screamed and stumbled backward, blood running from a dozen tiny cuts on his cheeks. "Finish that sentence," Nora called down from the darkness, her voice shaking with fury and adrenaline. "Go ahead, Judge. Finish it." Beaumont clutched his bleeding face. He stared up into the blackness where her voice had come from, and for the first time, Nora saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. The fear of a man who had always held power and suddenly realized he was in someone else's house. "Kill them!" Beaumont screamed. "Kill them both!" The hall erupted. Gunfire lit the darkness in strobing flashes of white and orange. Nora pressed herself flat behind the pillar as bullets chipped the marble around her. She fumbled with the shotgun, breaking it open, ejecting the spent shell, loading another with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Josiah fired from the opposite balcony. 2 shots. 2 men dropped. He moved positions after each shot, a ghost in the darkness, firing from a different spot each time so they couldn't pin him down. Thomas released the oil. Gallons of crude flooded the marble floor at the base of the staircase. A man rushing the stairs went down hard, his legs flying out from under him. His torch hit the oil. A river of flame raced across the floor. In the sudden flare of light, Nora saw Crawford charging up the stairs, his pickaxe raised over his head, his face twisted into something barely human. He was coming straight for her. She raised the shotgun. Crawford saw the barrel. He didn't stop. He was too full of rage, too full of the humiliation of being rejected by a woman he considered his property. "You were supposed to be mine!" Crawford screamed. Nora fired. The blast caught Crawford in the shoulder. He spun, the pickaxe clattering away down the stairs, and he fell, sliding on the oil-slicked marble, howling in pain. "I was never yours," Nora said. A stick of dynamite sailed through the air. Nora saw the fuse sparking. She didn't have time to run. Josiah came out of nowhere, slamming into her, driving her behind the heavy oak door of the upper corridor. The explosion tore apart the staircase railing. Stone and marble flew like shrapnel. The concussion slammed them both against the wall. Josiah didn't get up. "Josiah!" Nora rolled him over. Blood was streaming from a gash above his eye. His left leg was twisted at a bad angle. Shrapnel. He was conscious but dazed, his eyes unfocused. "Josiah, stay with me! Stay with me!" "How many left?" he gasped. Nora peered around the doorframe. Through the smoke and firelight, she could see Beaumont and Pardo and 2 other men still standing. Crawford was crawling down the stairs, leaving a trail of blood. 3 men were on the floor and not moving. "4 still up," she said, "including Beaumont." Josiah tried to stand. His leg buckled, and he went down hard, biting back a scream. "The lever," he gasped. "Behind the tapestry. East wall. The emergency purge. The floor opens." Nora looked at him. "What?" "My father built traps into every room. The Great Hall floor has a section that drops into the ventilation shaft. 200 feet straight down into the underground river. The lever is behind the tapestry on the east wall of the landing. You want me to drop them into a hole. I want you to survive." He grabbed her arm. His grip was iron despite the blood loss. "Nora, listen to me. Beaumont won't stop. Even if we drive him out tonight, he'll come back with 20 men, 50 men, the territorial militia. This ends now, or it never ends." Below them, Beaumont's voice echoed through the smoke. "Pardo, get up those stairs! Finish this!" Nora looked at the shotgun. She had 1 shell left. She looked at her husband, bleeding on the floor. She looked at the tapestry on the east wall, 20 feet away across an exposed landing. "Ruth!" Nora shouted into the corridor behind her. "I need you!" Ruth appeared, covered in dust, the cast-iron skillet still in her hand. "I'm here, child. Keep him alive," Nora said, nodding at Josiah. "I'm going to end this." "Nora, don't." Josiah reached for her. She was already gone. She sprinted across the landing, staying low, her shoes sliding on the debris-covered marble. A bullet whizzed past her head, so close she felt the heat of it on her ear. She reached the east wall and grabbed the tapestry, yanking it aside. The lever was there, a heavy iron mechanism set into the stone, exactly where Josiah said it would be. "Beaumont!" Nora shouted. She stepped to the edge of the landing, making herself visible. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever done. She stood in the firelight, the shotgun hanging at her side, and she looked down at the judge. Beaumont looked up at her. His face was cut and bleeding, his fine coat ruined, his composure shattered, but his gun was steady. "It's over, girl," he snarled.
"You've got nothing left." "You're right," Nora said. "I've got nothing. I had nothing the day you destroyed my father. I had nothing the day you tried to sell me to Crawford. I've been nothing my whole life in your eyes." She put her hand on the lever. "But my father taught me something you never learned, Judge. He taught me that the meek don't just inherit the earth. Sometimes they open it up and swallow the wicked whole." She pulled the lever. The marble floor beneath Beaumont's feet split open, with a sound like the mountain cracking in half. Beaumont looked down. For one frozen second, his eyes met Nora's. She saw the understanding hit him, the terrible, final realization that he had been beaten by the daughter of the man he'd destroyed. Then he fell. His scream echoed up the shaft for a long, long time before the river swallowed it. Pardo and the two remaining men stared at the hole in the floor. They stared at Nora, standing on the landing, with her hand on the lever and the fire burning behind her. They stared at the bodies of their companions, and the blood on the stairs, and the smoke in the air. Pardo dropped his gun. It clattered on the marble and slid toward the edge of the open shaft. "I'm done," Pardo said. He raised his hands. "I'm done. Ain't no amount of money worth this." The other two followed, guns down, hands up. From somewhere in the corridor, Ruth's voice rang out. "Josiah Mercer, you stay down, or so help me God, I will sit on you." Nora sank to her knees on the landing. The shotgun fell from her hand. Her whole body was shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last 20 minutes drained out of her like water through a cracked cup, leaving nothing but exhaustion and a grief so vast she couldn't see the edges of it. She had killed a man. She had dropped a man into a hole in the earth and listened to him scream all the way down. And the man she'd killed was the same man who had sat in a courtroom and sentenced her father to die. She didn't know if she should pray or throw up. Josiah dragged himself across the floor to her. His leg was useless. His face was a mask of blood, but he pulled himself along the marble with his arms until he reached her. He put his hand on the back of her neck and pulled her forehead against his. "It's over," he whispered. "Nora, it's over." "My father," she said, and her voice broke into pieces. "He's gone, and he'll never know. He'll never know "He knows," Josiah said. "Believe me, he knows." They sat on the ruined landing of the great hall, holding each other in the smoke and the firelight, while below them the mountain kept its secrets and the river carried away the last of Judge Harlan Beaumont's ambitions. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the mountain, for the first time in 10 years, the silence felt like peace. 6 weeks. That's how long it took for Josiah's leg to heal enough for him to stand without cursing. Ruth changed his bandages every morning and every night. And every morning and every night, she told him the same thing. "If you put weight on that leg before I say so, I will break the other one myself." Josiah obeyed. Not because he feared Ruth Gatewood, though any sane man would. He obeyed because every time he tried to stand, Nora was there, pressing her hand against his chest, pushing him back into the leather wingback chair with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Sit down, Josiah." "I need to check the perimeter." "Thomas checked the perimeter. Sit down." "The blast doors need to be repaired. If someone else comes up that trail—" "No one is coming up that trail. Pardo and the others are locked in the lower storage chamber with enough food and water to keep them alive, and Thomas sealed the main tunnel with a rockfall charge. No one is getting in or out until we decide they do." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Sit down."
Josiah sat down. This was the new rhythm of life inside the mountain. Josiah healed, Nora ran the household, and somewhere between the bandage changes and the arguments about when he could walk again, the invisible wall between them dissolved so completely that neither of them could remember when it had been there. It happened in small moments. Nora reading aloud to him from the library because he couldn't walk there himself. Josiah teaching her the investment ledgers because his hands were restless and his mind needed work. The first time she fell asleep in the chair beside his bed, a book open on her lap, and he pulled a blanket over her shoulders without waking her. The first time he laughed, a real laugh, deep and startled, because she'd said something sharp about the quality of his father's taste in furniture. "Your father built a palace inside a mountain," Nora said, standing in front of an enormous oil painting of a horse that was, by any objective standard, hideous. "He engineered mirrors to channel sunlight through solid rock. He designed a ventilation system that doubles as a defensive weapon. And this is what he chose to hang on the wall?" Josiah looked at the painting. "That was his horse, Bartholomew." "The horse looks like it's having a religious experience." "My father loved that horse more than he loved most people." Based on this painting, the feeling was not mutual. Josiah laughed. It burst out of him like something that had been locked in a box for years. Nora turned and stared at him. She had never heard him laugh before. Not like this. It changed his whole face. The hard lines softened. The haunted look in his eyes lifted. For a moment, he looked like the young man he must have been before the war took him apart. "Don't stop," she said quietly.
"Don't stop what?"
"Laughing. It suits you." He looked at her with an expression she was learning to recognize. It was the way he looked at her when he forgot to guard himself. When the soldier and the hermit stepped aside and the man underneath showed his face. "You suit me," he said. Then he looked away, as if the admission had cost him something he couldn't afford. Nora walked over and sat on the arm of his chair. He tensed, the way he always did when she got close. The old instinct to retreat still firing, even when the rest of him wanted to stay. She took his hand. He let her. "Josiah, when this is over, when we go back down that mountain, what happens?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you want to stay hidden? Do you want to go back to being the hermit? Because I'll do it, if that's what you need. I'll stay in this mountain for the rest of my life and read every book in that library and argue with Ruth about how much salt goes in the soup. But I need to know if that's the plan." Josiah was quiet for a long time. His thumb traced slow circles on the back of her hand. "My father hid because he was afraid," Josiah said. "He found the silver, and he looked at the world and he decided the world wasn't safe enough for what he had. So he buried himself alive in here, and he died in here, and the only people who mourned him were Ruth and Thomas and me." He paused. "I don't want to die in here, Nora." "Then we don't hide." "It's not that simple. Beaumont is gone, but there are others. The territorial government, the mining companies. The moment anyone learns about this place, they'll come for it." "Then we don't let them come for it. We go to them first." Nora squeezed his hand. "Your father hid his wealth. That's why it became a target. Rumors grow in the dark, Josiah. Legends breed in silence. But if we walk into Copper Bend with our heads up and our name on a bank account, we're not a legend anymore. We're neighbors. We're employers. We're the family that owns the mill and fixes the church roof and pays fair wages." She leaned in. "You can't rob a man the whole town depends on, not without the town fighting back." Josiah looked at her. "When did you become a strategist?" "When I married a man who had a fortune and no idea what to do with it." She stood up. I've been going through your father's papers, the investments, the shell companies in San Francisco and Pittsburgh. Josiah, your father wasn't just rich. He was building something. He was buying into railroads and steel and shipping. He had a plan, but he was too afraid to execute it. And you're not afraid? I'm terrified, Nora said, but I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life in a cave than I am of anything Copper Bend can throw at me. That was the night things changed between them in the last way they hadn't yet. Not with words or strategies or arguments, just two people in a dark room who had stopped being afraid of each other. When Nora woke the next morning, she was in the west wing, not the east, and the space beside her was warm where Josiah had been. She found him in the kitchen with Thomas, standing on his bad leg, ignoring Ruth's threats. They were looking at a map spread across the table. "You're standing," Nora said from the doorway. "Ruth's going to kill me," Josiah said without looking up. "I surely am," Ruth called from the pantry. "What are you planning?" Nora asked, walking over to the table. "Thomas went down the mountain yesterday," Josiah said, "through the north shaft, the one that comes out on the scree slope. He made it to the trading post at Miller's Fork." Thomas nodded. "Town's in bad shape, Mrs. Mercer. Beaumont's disappearance hit them hard. The bank's near insolvent. Finch, the man Beaumont left in charge, he's been sending foreclosure notices to every farm in the valley. The lumber mill shut down. Men are out of work. Families are leaving." "It gets worse," Josiah said. He pulled a folded newspaper from under the map and handed it to Nora. "Thomas picked this up at the post." Nora unfolded it. The Copper Bend Gazette. The headline read, "Sterling Judge Beaumont missing. Foul play suspected. Territorial Marshal dispatched." Her stomach dropped. "A marshal?" "Federal," Josiah said. "Coming from Cheyenne. He'll be in Copper Bend within the week. If he starts asking questions about Beaumont's disappearance, about where he went the night of the storm." Nora looked at Josiah. "The men in the storage chamber. Pardo and the others. They know everything." "That's what I've been thinking about," Josiah said. Nora sat down at the table. She read the article again, slowly. Then she looked at the map. Then she looked at her husband. "We have two problems," she said. "The first is the marshal. The second is the men downstairs. But they're actually the same problem. And there's one solution." "I'm listening." "We don't hide what happened. We tell the truth." She held up a hand before Josiah could protest. "Not all of it. Not the mountain. Not the silver. But the truth about Beaumont. He came up this mountain with 8 armed men and dynamite to kill a homesteader and steal his land. That's not a secret. That's a crime. And we have witnesses." "Witnesses who participated in the crime," Josiah pointed out. "Witnesses who will testify against a dead man to save their own necks." Nora tapped the newspaper. "Pardo knows everything. He tracked for Beaumont for years. He knows about the land grabs, the embezzlement, the bribes. If we offer him clemency in exchange for testimony, he'll sing like a bird on Easter Sunday." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "She's good." "She's terrifying," Josiah said, but there was pride in his voice. "What about Crawford?" "Crawford is a different problem. Crawford is alive, and he'll want revenge." "Crawford took a load of buckshot in the shoulder from his own wife-to-be," Thomas said. "I don't think that man wants to be anywhere near Mrs. Mercer ever again." "He's not rational," Nora said. "He's vain and he's cruel, and I humiliated him twice, once in the courtroom and once on the stairs. Men like Crawford don't forget that." "So what do we do with him?" "The same thing we do with Pardo. We give him a choice. Testify against Beaumont's operation and leave the territory, or face charges as an accomplice to attempted murder." She looked at Josiah. "Your attempted murder. And mine. A federal marshal will take that seriously." Josiah leaned back against the table, crossing his arms. His bad leg was trembling from the effort of standing, but he didn't sit down. "You're talking about walking into Copper Bend and dismantling everything Beaumont built. His network, his cronies, his hold on the town."
"Yes, and replacing it with what?" "Us." Nora's voice was steady. "We buy the bank. We buy the debt. Every family Beaumont squeezed, every farmer he foreclosed on, every miner he underpaid. We buy their freedom, and we give it back to them. Not as charity, as investment. A town that works is a town that produces. A town that produces makes everyone richer, including us." "Your father was a preacher," Josiah said. "But you think like a railroad baron." "My father taught me that mercy is strength. I just figured out how to fund it." Josiah looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back. Something passed between the two men, a silent conversation built on years of trust. "Well," Thomas said, "I always did say this mountain needed a woman's touch." They spent 5 days preparing. Josiah could walk now, with a limp and a cane carved from hickory. He shaved his beard down to a clean jaw that made Ruth cluck with approval, and Nora stare in a way that made him clear his throat and look elsewhere. Thomas brought up a trunk from the lower chambers that held Thaddeus Mercer's finest clothes, tailored suits that fit Josiah like they'd been made for him. Nora went through the wardrobe of Josiah's mother, a woman she was learning about through the clothes she'd left behind. Fine fabrics, bold colors. A woman who had lived in a hidden palace and dressed like she was going to a ball every night because she refused to let isolation diminish her. "Your mother had taste," Nora said, holding up a gown of deep crimson velvet. "My mother had opinions," Josiah said. "About everything. She would have liked you." "Because I have opinions?" "Because you're the only person I've met who has more of them than she did." On the morning of the 6th day, Nora went to the lower storage chamber. Thomas unlocked the heavy iron door. Inside, Pardo and the 2 surviving men sat on crates. Crawford was in a separate cell, his shoulder wrapped in bandages that Ruth had grudgingly provided. Pardo stood up when Nora walked in. He looked smaller than he had in the great hall, diminished. The slouch hat was gone, and without it, he was just a lean, weathered man in his 40s with nervous eyes. "Ma'am," Pardo said. "Mr. Pardo, I have a proposition." Pardo's eyes flicked to the door, where Thomas stood with a rifle. "I'm listening." "A federal marshal is coming to Copper Bend to investigate Judge Beaumont's disappearance. You have 2 options. Option 1, I hand you over to the marshal and you stand trial for breaking and entering, destruction of property, and attempted murder of a territorial citizen and his wife. You'll hang." Pardo swallowed. "Option 2? You write a full confession detailing every illegal act Judge Beaumont ordered you to carry out. Land grabs, intimidation, bribery, everything. You testify before the marshal. In exchange, my husband and I petition for clemency. You leave Wyoming territory, and you never come back." "You want me to rat on a dead man?"
"I want you to tell the truth about a corrupt man who used his position to steal from innocent people and destroy anyone who stood in his way." Nora's voice hardened. "Including my father, Reverend Hadley. You tracked for Beaumont when he went after our church's funds. You were there." Pardo's face went gray. "I didn't know what he was planning. I just tracked. That's all I ever did." "And now you'll talk. That's all you need to do." She held out a pen and a sheet of paper. "Start with the land grabs. Work forward." Pardo took the pen. His hand was shaking. "The other boys?" "Same deal.
Write and walk, or stay and hang. And Crawford? Nora glanced at the separate cell. She could feel Crawford's eyes on her through the bars. Hot, hateful. He hadn't spoken since the battle, but his silence was louder than his screaming had been. Crawford is a separate conversation, Nora said. She walked to his cell. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his bandaged shoulder held stiffly. His face was pale from blood loss and rage in equal measure. When he saw her, his lip curled. "Come to gloat?" Crawford spat. "I came to offer you your life," Nora said. "Same deal as Pardo. Testify against Beaumont's network, leave the territory, live." Crawford laughed. It was a bitter, ugly sound. "You shot me. You came at me with a pickaxe. You were supposed to be mine, Hadley. I had a deal with the judge. I paid him $300 for you, $300, and a promise to look the other way when the bank auditors came. That's what you cost. $300. Nora's hands were steady at her sides, but inside, something cold and sharp turned over in her chest. $300. That was the price of her life. The price Beaumont and Crawford had agreed on, like two men haggling over a horse. "My name is Mercer," Nora said quietly, "and I'm not here to discuss what I cost. I'm here to discuss what it will cost you to refuse. I ain't signing nothing, and when I get out of here, and I will get out, I'm going to make sure everyone in the territory knows what your husband is hiding in this mountain. Every miner, every prospector, every land speculator from here to California. They'll come for you like ants on honey." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Thomas. "Keep him locked up. He'll ride down with us. The marshal can have him." "You can't do that!" Crawford lurched forward, grabbing the bars with his good hand. "I'll tell them everything. The mountain, the silver, the trapdoors, everything." Nora stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. "Who's going to believe you, Mr. Crawford? A wounded man, caught trespassing on a homesteader's property with dynamite and a pickaxe, claiming there's a silver palace inside a mountain?" She paused. "They'll think the fever took your mind, and the more you talk, the crazier you'll sound." She walked out. Thomas locked the door on Crawford's screaming. In the corridor, Nora leaned against the stone wall. Her hands were shaking now. She pressed them flat against the cold rock and closed her eyes. "You all right, Mrs. Mercer?" Thomas asked gently. $300, she whispered. "He paid $300 for me. Like I was livestock." "You ain't livestock, ma'am. You're the woman who just looked that man in the eye and took his voice away. That's not something livestock does." Nora opened her eyes. She straightened up. She smoothed the front of her dress. "Is the carriage ready?" "Josiah's loading the last of the bullion now. We can leave at first light." "Good." She started walking back toward the great hall. "Tell Ruth to pack food for 3 days. And tell my husband to wear the charcoal suit, the one with the silver buttons." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "Yes, ma'am." That night, their last night inside the mountain, Nora couldn't sleep. She stood in the great hall alone, looking up at the broken mirrors and the shattered staircase railing. Scorch marks blackened the marble where the oil had burned. Bullet holes pocked the columns. The tapestry she'd torn down to reach the lever still lay in a heap on the landing. This place had almost been their tomb. Now it was their treasury. And tomorrow they would carry its power down the mountain and into a town that had thrown them away. Josiah found her there. He walked slowly, the cane tapping on the marble, and stood beside her. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. "No,"
I'm having all the thoughts. Every single one." She looked at him. "What if they don't accept us? What if buying the bank and forgiving the debts isn't enough? What if they still see the hermit and the preacher's disgraced daughter?" "They will," Josiah said. "At first. People don't change their minds because you're generous. They change their minds because you're consistent. We show up. We stay. We do what we say we'll do. And eventually, the story they tell about us changes." "When did you get wise?" "I married a woman who won't let me be stupid." Nora leaned into him. He put his arm around her, heavy and warm. They stood together in the broken hall, two people who had come into this mountain as strangers, and were leaving it as something else entirely. Partners. Allies. The kind of married that goes beyond a ceremony in a courthouse. The kind of married that gets forged in fire and blood, and the long quiet hours between. "Josiah." "When we get to town, when we walk into that bank, I need you to let me do the talking." "I always let you do the talking." "I need you to let me do the talking about my father, about Beaumont, about what he did to our family. The town needs to hear it from me, not from a confession, not from a marshal, from me." Josiah tightened his arm around her. "Whatever you need, Nora. And I need you to stand behind me, not in front of me, behind me. So they see that you trust me. So they see that the strongest man on this mountain puts his faith in his wife." Josiah turned and looked at her. In the dim lamplight, his face was open and unguarded in a way that still surprised her. The soldier, the hermit, the tycoon, all of them stripped away. Just a man looking at the woman who had changed everything. "I will stand wherever you tell me to stand," he said, "for as long as you'll have me." Nora kissed him. It was softer than their first kiss, the one that had tasted of desperation and years of solitude. This one tasted like a promise. "First light," she said against his lips. "We ride at first light." The mountain held them one more night, and in the morning, when the sun broke over the peaks and poured through the shattered mirrors in broken shafts of gold, Nora Mercer walked out of the tunnel and into the daylight with her head high, her husband at her back, and the weight of an empire in the wagon behind her. Copper Bend had no idea what was coming. The carriage rolled into Copper Bend on a Tuesday morning in late October, and the first person to see it was old Walt Hennessy, who was sweeping the porch of the general store because there was nothing left inside worth selling. Walt stopped sweeping. He squinted at the road. Then he dropped the broom. The carriage was black, polished to a mirror shine, pulled by 4 white horses that moved with a kind of coordinated grace that only money could buy. The driver sat high on the box in a charcoal livery with silver buttons. Behind the carriage, tied to a lead rope, rode 3 men on horseback, with their hands bound to their saddle horns. One of them had a bandaged shoulder and a face full of murder. "Lord Almighty," Walt whispered. He turned and hollered through the open door. "Mabel! Mabel, get out here! You ain't gonna believe this!" By the time the carriage reached the center of town, half of Copper Bend was on the street. They came out of the saloon and the feed store and the shuttered bank. They came off porches and out of alleys. The blacksmith put down his hammer. The school teacher held her students back from the windows. Even the dog stopped barking and sat down, as if they understood that something was happening that required silence. Thomas pulled the carriage to a stop in front of the bank. He climbed down, straightened his coat, and opened the carriage door. He unfolded a set of steps covered in dark velvet. A boot emerged. Black leather, polished, without a speck of dust. Josiah Mercer stepped out, and the town of Copper Bend lost its collective breath. They remembered a giant in stained buckskins who smelled like a wet dog and spoke to no one. This man wore a tailored 3-piece suit of charcoal wool. A gold watch chain hung across his vest. His beard was gone, revealing a jaw that was hard and square and belonged on a statue. He carried a hickory cane, and he leaned on it just enough to suggest that whatever had happened to his leg was the other man's problem now. His eyes swept the crowd with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side holding the deed. He didn't speak. He turned back to the carriage and extended his hand. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. Nora took his hand and descended the steps. She wore the crimson velvet gown that had belonged to Josiah's mother. A heavy coat with a fur collar hung over her shoulders. At her throat, a necklace of silver and garnets caught the morning sun and threw light across the faces of the people staring at her. She stood on the boardwalk and looked out at the town that had laughed at her wedding. The town that had called her father a thief. The town that had put her on an auction block and sold her future to the highest bidder. She looked at each of them. The baker who'd refused her credit. The women who'd called her a fallen woman. The sheriff who'd stood by while Beaumont destroyed her family. She looked at them, and they looked at her. And what they saw in her face made them step back. "They're staring," Josiah murmured beside her. "Good," Nora said. "Let them." The bank door opened. Edgar Finch stumbled out, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers. He was thinner than he'd been 6 weeks ago. His suit hung on him like a scarecrow's clothes. Running an insolvent bank under the shadow of a missing judge had taken 20 pounds off his frame and 20 years off his life. Can I help you folks?" Finch stammered. The bank is technically closed. Liquidity issues, if you're looking for." "We're not looking for anything, Mr. Finch," Nora said. Her voice carried down the street like a bell. "We're here to make a deposit." Finch blinked. "A deposit?" "Inside," Josiah said. It wasn't a request. Finch scrambled backward through the door, holding it open. Josiah and Nora swept inside. The crowd pressed against the windows, faces flattened against the glass, desperate to see. The bank smelled like fear and old paper. Dust coated every surface. The teller window was closed. The vault door hung open, revealing shelves that were mostly empty. Nora ran a gloved finger along the counter. She looked at Finch, who was standing behind his desk, with the expression of a man watching a rattlesnake coil. "Sit down, Mr. Finch," Nora said. Finch sat. "Cornelius Beaumont is dead," Nora said. The words landed in the room like a stone in a pond. Finch's face went white. His mouth opened and closed several times. "Dead," he repeated. "How? When? The marshal is coming. He's been asking questions. I didn't know what to tell him. "You'll tell him the truth," Nora said. "The truth is that Judge Beaumont organized a raiding party of 8 armed men, rode up into the mountains, and attempted to murder my husband on his own property using dynamite and firearms. My husband defended himself. Beaumont died in the process." Finch looked at Josiah, who was leaning on his cane with the patient stillness of a man who had all the time in the world. Then Finch looked at the carriage outside, where 3 bound men sat on horses. "The survivors?" Finch whispered. "Witnesses," Nora corrected. "They've provided full written confessions detailing Judge Beaumont's criminal activities over the past 15 years. Land seizures, embezzlement, bribery of territorial officials, witness intimidation, and the wrongful conviction of my father, Reverend Isaac Hadley, on fabricated charges of theft." Finch's hand went to his collar. He tugged at it like it was choking him. "Those confessions also name accomplices," Nora continued. She let the word hang in the air. "Bank officials who falsified records. Citizens who provided false testimony. Anyone who took money from Beaumont to look the other way." "Mrs. Mercer, I had no choice, Finch blurted. He would have ruined me. He would have destroyed my family. You don't understand what it was like, living under that man's thumb. I understand exactly what it was like, Nora said, and her voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. I grew up under it. My father died under it. Don't tell me what I don't understand. Finch shrank into his chair. Josiah stepped forward. He set a leather satchel on the desk. The heavy metallic thud made the floorboards vibrate. Open it. Finch undid the buckles with shaking fingers. When he folded back the flap, the color drained from his face so fast, Nora thought he might faint. Gold. Rough cast bars stamped with a single mark. Mercer. That's $10,000 in bullion, Josiah said. There's another $40,000 in the carriage. Finch looked up. His eyes were the size of dinner plates. $50,000. We're buying the bank, Nora said. We're buying the debt. Every cent owed by every family in this town is now held by the Mercer Trust. But the paperwork, the territorial approvals, Nora reached into her coat and placed a thick envelope on top of the gold. Transfer of ownership documents, drawn up by a territorial attorney in Cheyenne. Pardo's confession, naming Beaumont's network of corruption. A detailed accounting of every illegal transaction processed through this bank under your supervision. She paused. And a letter of resignation with your name on it. All it needs is your signature. Finch stared at the envelope. And if I don't sign? Then the marshal gets the accounting records, and you explain to a federal judge why you helped Beaumont embezzle $17,000 from the territorial school fund. Nora's voice didn't waver. You'll go to prison, Mr. Finch. Not the territorial jail. Federal prison. And your wife and children will be left with nothing. The same nothing Beaumont left me. Finch picked up a pen. His hand was shaking so badly that the first two attempts at his signature were illegible. The third one held. Where do I go? Finch whispered. Anywhere that isn't here, Josiah said. The evening stage leaves at 4. Be on it. Finch stood up. He looked around the bank like a man seeing it for the last time. Then he walked out the door without his coat, without his hat, without looking back. The crowd parted for him. Nobody said a word. Nobody had to. The look on his face said everything. Josiah and Nora stepped out of the bank together. The crowd had grown. It seemed like every man, woman, and child in Copper Bend was standing in the street, staring at the two people they had written off as dead. Josiah looked out over them. He planted his cane and stood straight, and the mountain man was gone. In his place was a patriarch, a man who owned the ground beneath their feet and had earned it in blood. The bank is under new management, Josiah announced. His voice still had the gravel of the mountain in it, but now it carried across the street and up the canyon walls like thunder. Finch is gone. Beaumont is gone. Their debts died with them. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Confusion, disbelief, hope, buried so deep under years of oppression that most of them didn't recognize it anymore. What about our loans? A voice called from the back. It was Emmeline Flood, Emmy, Nora's oldest friend. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, thin as a rail, holding the hands of her two small children. Her husband had died in the mines 3 years ago, and she'd been surviving on credit and stubbornness ever since. I owe the bank $200, Mrs. Mercer. I can't pay it. I've never been able to pay it. Beaumont's rates were bleeding me dry. Nora walked down the bank steps. The crowd parted. She stopped in front of Emmy and looked at her friend. Emmy's dress was threadbare. Her children's shoes had holes. But she was standing upright, her chin high, her eyes meeting Nora's without flinching. There are no more Beaumont rates, Nora said. Her voice was strong enough for the crowd, but gentle enough for her friend. Interest on all agricultural and homestead loans is suspended until the spring harvest. The lumber mill will reopen within the month. We need workers. Honest work for honest pay. Emmy's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her lips together and nodded. Nora took Emmy's hand and held it. "I should have written to you," Nora said quietly. "When everything happened, I should have found a way." "You were surviving," Emmy said. "Same as me. Same as all of us." Nora squeezed her hand, then turned to face the crowd again. Her gaze found the cluster of women who had stood on the courthouse steps the day of her wedding and called her a fool. Mrs. Adeline Pruitt, Mrs. Gable, the gossip, Mrs. Hanson, the seamstress. They were huddled together now, their faces pale, their eyes darting between Nora's jewelry and the bound men on the horses, and the gold visible through the open bank door. Nora walked toward them. They shrank back. Mrs. Pruitt actually raised her hand as if expecting to be struck. "Mrs. Pruitt," Nora said. "Mrs. Mercer, we never meant any harm. It was just talk. We didn't." "I know what it was," Nora said. "I know what all of it was. Fear. You were afraid of Beaumont. You were afraid that if you showed me kindness, he'd turn on you the way he turned on my father. So you joined in. You laughed when you should have spoken up. You closed your doors when you should have opened them." Mrs. Pruitt was crying. Mrs. Gable was staring at the ground. "I could make you pay for that," Nora said. The street went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I own your mortgages now. Every single one. I could foreclose on every house on this street, and there isn't a judge in the territory who could stop me." She let the silence stretch. She let them feel it. The same helplessness she had felt on that platform. The same terror of being at someone else's mercy. Then she took Mrs. Pruitt's hand. "But I won't," Nora said, "because my father taught me that mercy isn't weakness. Mercy is the hardest kind of strength there is. He showed mercy to everyone in this town, even the ones who didn't deserve it. They killed him for it, but they didn't kill what he stood for." She looked at the crowd. "This town has been living under a tyrant's boot for 15 years. That boot is gone. What you do next is up to you. You can go back to being afraid. You can whisper behind your hands and look out for nobody but yourselves. Or you can be the town my father believed you could be. The town he preached about. The town that takes care of its own." Mrs. Pruitt sobbed and gripped Nora's hand with both of hers. "The church," she choked out. "The roof's been leaking since spring. We couldn't afford to fix it. Beaumont said it wasn't a priority." "It's a priority now," Nora said. "Come to the bank tomorrow. We'll arrange the funds." A sound went through the crowd. Not quite a cheer. Something deeper. Something that had been held down for so long it didn't know how to come out. Men took off their hats. Women wiped their eyes. The blacksmith, a huge man named Henderson, who hadn't spoken to anyone in months, walked forward and extended his hand to Josiah. "Mr. Mercer," Henderson said, "I owe you an apology. I laughed at you on your wedding day. I called you a name I won't repeat. That wasn't right." Josiah took his hand. "Forgotten." "It shouldn't be forgotten," Henderson said. "It should be remembered, so we don't do it again." Josiah looked at the blacksmith for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." Reverend Pruitt pushed through the crowd. He was trembling, his Bible clutched to his chest, but his face was shining. "Nora, your father would be so proud, so proud. I've kept his Bible, the one they took from him at the trial. I kept it all these years. It's at the church. It belongs to you. Nora's composure finally cracked. Just a fraction. Just enough for a single tear to escape before she caught it with the back of her glove. Thank you, Reverend. We'll come for it on Sunday. At service. Where it belongs. There's one more thing, Josiah said. He looked at Nora. She nodded. Josiah turned to the crowd. The marshal from Cheyenne will arrive in a few days. He'll be looking into Judge Beaumont's activities. The Mercer Trust will be providing him with full documentation of the judge's corruption, including his role in the wrongful conviction of Reverend Isaac Hadley. The silence that followed was deafening. My wife's father was innocent, Josiah said. His voice was low, but it carried like a drumbeat. He was framed by Beaumont to seize the church's land. The evidence is in the confessions. Every detail, every lie, every dollar Beaumont pocketed while a good man rotted in a cell. Nora stepped forward. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm not asking you to feel guilty. I'm asking you to remember him the way he was, not the way Beaumont made him seem. A man who opened his church to everyone. A man who stood up when standing up cost him everything. Her voice steadied. His name was Isaac Hadley, and he deserved better than what this town gave him. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The weight of 15 years of complicity settled over Copper Bend like a fog. Some people cried. Some people looked away. The sheriff, a man named Dawson who had served Beaumont's warrants without question, took off his badge and walked into the saloon without a word. It was Emmy Flood who broke the silence. She let go of her children's hands, walked forward, and hugged Nora. Just wrapped her thin arms around her and held on. Welcome home, Nora, Emmy whispered. One by one, others came forward. Henderson, the blacksmith. Old Walt from the general store. Mrs. Hanson, the seamstress, who pressed a handkerchief into Nora's hand and couldn't speak. Reverend Pruitt, who shook Josiah's hand and then pulled him into an embrace that clearly startled the mountain man into stiffness before he slowly, awkwardly returned it. The crowd didn't disperse. They gathered closer. Not around the gold or the carriage or the bound men on the horses. Around Nora and Josiah. Around the two people who had been driven out with nothing and returned with everything, and chosen mercy over power. Thomas unloaded the last of the bullion into the bank. Ruth, who had ridden in the back of the carriage and refused to sit idle for a single minute, was already in the bank kitchen making coffee for anyone who wanted it. Within an hour, there was a line out the door. Not for money, for conversation, for reassurance, for the simple human need to look someone trustworthy in the eye and hear that things were going to be all right. Late that afternoon, when the crowd had finally thinned and the October sun was dropping behind the canyon walls, Josiah and Nora stood alone on the boardwalk in front of the bank. The street was quiet. The bound men had been taken to the jail to wait for the marshal. Ruth and Thomas were inside, organizing ledgers. The town was settling into the strange, fragile peace of a place that had just changed hands. Josiah leaned on his cane and looked up at the mountains. The peaks were already white with early snow. Somewhere up there, hidden behind a false cliff face and 1,000 feet of stone, the sanctuary waited. You know, he said quietly, they still think I'm just a miner who got lucky. Let them, Nora said. She stood beside him, close enough that her shoulder touched his arm. Her crimson dress was dusty now, the velvet marked with the long ride down, but the necklace at her throat still caught the fading light. They don't need to know everything. They just need to know we're here, and that we're staying, and that we're staying. Josiah turned to her. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his rough fingers gentle against her temple. Your father's Bible. You sure you want to wait until Sunday? I'm sure. I want to walk into that church on a Sunday morning the way he used to. Through the front door, with my head up.
And I want every person in that congregation to see his daughter standing where he stood. She paused, with her husband beside her. Behind her, Josiah corrected softly. You said you wanted me behind you. Nora smiled. It wasn't the shy smile of the girl who'd stood on the auction block. It wasn't the cold smile she'd given Finch in the bank. It was the smile of a woman who had walked through grief and rage and fear and come out on the other side, holding the hand of a man who had done the same. Beside me, she said. I changed my mind. I want you beside me. Josiah kissed her, right there on the boardwalk, in front of God and the mountains and the stray dog that had been following them since they arrived. It wasn't a polite kiss. It was the kind of kiss that a man gives when he has spent 10 years in the dark, and someone has finally opened the door. When they pulled apart, Nora rested her forehead against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong. Josiah, Thank you for coming into that courtroom. He was quiet for a moment. His hand rested on the back of her neck, warm and heavy. Thank you for saying yes. They stood together as the sun went down and the first stars appeared over Copper Bend. The town was still. The mountains held their secrets. And in the morning, there would be work to do. A bank to run. A mill to reopen. A marshal to meet. A church roof to fix. And 100 small acts of mercy that would, over time, build something that no amount of gold could buy. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, there was just this. A man and a woman on a quiet street, holding each other in the fading light, proving what Nora's father had preached and what Josiah's father had forgotten. That the strongest fortress isn't built of stone and silver. It's built of the choice to stay when the world gives you every reason to leave. It's built of the stubborn, reckless, holy decision to believe that people can be better than they've been. Nora Hadley had walked into that courtroom with nothing but her father's name and the dress on her back. Nora Mercer walked out of it with an empire, a husband who would move mountains for her, and a town that would never laugh at her again. Not because they feared her, because they loved her. And that made all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale. And leave me a comment telling me what city you're watching from and what you thought of Nora's choice to forgive instead of destroy. Was it mercy? Or was it the ultimate power move? I read every single comment, and your words keep these stories coming. Until next time, take care of each other out there. The world could use a few more Noras.